Good to have you here again. Same sidewalk, same city, same minute. One side of the street, 51 degrees Celsius. That's 124 Fahrenheit. Hot enough to leave a mark on skin in under a minute. 3 steps to the left, under the edge of a canopy, 31 degrees, 88 Fahrenheit. The air didn't change. The sun didn't move. The official weather report for your city says it's 34 degrees, 93 Fahrenheit, everywhere. Your body knows something the weather report doesn't. You just crossed the border. Nobody put up a sign. Nobody built a wall. It took you about 1 second. Today isn't about a heat wave. Heat waves come and go. We're talking about something older and much more permanent. We're talking about shade. Who owns it? Who doesn't? And why that 20-degree line on the sidewalk might be one of the most honest maps of power ever drawn. Here's what's actually happening on that sidewalk. Concrete and asphalt aren't just hot, they're batteries. High thermal mass means they spend all day charging on sunlight, and they don't stop discharging just because the sun goes down. That's why a parking lot at 10 p.m. can still feel like a furnace. Satellite thermal imaging shows that a city isn't one heat source. It's an archipelago, islands of extreme heat, separated by cooler channels of shade and green. In some neighborhoods, the hottest moment of the day isn't noon. It's well after sunset, the pavement still discharging the heat it swallowed hours earlier. The city is remembering the sun long after it's gone. None of this is complicated physics. It's just repeated a few million times across a few hundred square kilometers. But almost none of it was built with heat in mind at all, which raises an obvious question. What were cities doing before any of this technology existed? Here's something that should surprise you. Ancient Rome had actual property law about sunlight and shadow between neighbors. Servitudes, they were called. If your neighbor built a wall that blocked your access to light, you could take them to court. But notice what that law protected, not shade, light. In a world without electric lighting, sunlight was a valuable contested resource for warmth, for visibility, for keeping a home from feeling like a damp cave. The exact fight we'd expect to have today over shade ran in the opposite direction 2,000 years ago. Shade, meanwhile, wasn't a legal right. It was something you built for yourself, if you could afford it. The wealthy built villas around internal courtyards, oriented to block the harsh afternoon sun while still catching a breeze. Architectural knowledge refined over centuries and not cheap. And when architecture wasn't enough, there was a second, stranger market. Every summer, runners and mule trains hauled snow down from the mountains, packed in straw, racing the melt back into the city. It was stored underground in pits called niveria, sometimes sold for more than wine. Seneca and Vitruvius both wrote about it, a little disapprovingly, as a display of excess. Nero reportedly kept his baths cooled with snow hauled from 300 kilometers away. What the wealthiest Romans were really buying wasn't the snow. It was a feeling. The same feeling you got walking into that shade a minute ago for free because you happen to be standing in the right spot in a modern city. That's the pattern underneath this whole episode. Heat is natural. Shade has always had a price. And here's something that holds up across every civilization that's had to deal with serious heat. Rome, the Persian desert, your own city right now. They all solve it in the same order. First, they change time. When people move, when people rest. Then they change space. How a street is shaped, how a wall is angled. Only much later, once the wealth and the tools exist, do they change machinery. Time, space, machine. Not because anyone wrote it down as a rule, because each step is cheaper than the one after it, and you can't build the expensive step until you can afford it. Zoom back to today. A thermal map of most major cities looks almost like a fingerprint. Hot zones and cool corridors, sharply divided, block by block. It's tempting to imagine someone drew that map on purpose. Nobody did. A neighborhood built next to a 19th century rail yard needed wide, hard-paved roads for cargo, not trees. A residential district built decades later for a completely different purpose could afford wider lots and more canopy. Neither decision was about heat. 100 years later, the gap between them is measurable. Research across dozens of cities puts the difference between the hottest and coolest 10% of neighborhoods at 2 to 4 degrees Celsius on an ordinary summer day, not just during a heat wave. And yes, these patterns often overlap with income, because the areas with less canopy and more pavement also tend to be the ones that received less infrastructure investment over the decades. That's not a conspiracy, it's closer to inheritance. A house doesn't choose the foundation someone poured for it 100 years ago. Cities didn't design this. Cities accumulated it. Economists have a name for this: path dependency. An early decision, made for reasons that had nothing to do with temperature, quietly locks a place onto a trajectory that becomes very expensive to reverse. Then we invented the machine, and it changed the order. For thousands of years, the sequence was time, then space, then machine. The cheap steps first. In the 20th century, we started skipping straight to the end. We built glass towers that shouldn't exist in a desert and used machinery to fight the sun directly. But here's the part that should stop you. Air conditioning doesn't destroy heat, it moves it from your living room to the street outside. Peer-reviewed studies in Tokyo's office districts have measured air conditioning waste heat, raising the outdoor air temperature by 1 to 2 degrees Celsius on summer weekdays. Similar effects have been measured at night in Phoenix. The cooler you make your bedroom, the hotter you make your neighbor's sidewalk. Call it a thermal arms race. Everyone escalating the same machine, each one making the outdoor problem slightly worse for everyone else. Which is why the twist at the end of this story is almost funny. Some cities have quietly started copying 2,000-year-old homework instead. In 2013, Los Angeles became the first major U.S. city to require light-colored, cool roofs on new homes. The same principle as a whitewashed wall on a Greek island, reflecting sun instead of absorbing it. New York set out to plant 1 million trees across 5 boroughs, and met that goal. Across the Middle East, new buildings are reviving the Bajir, the ancient Persian wind tower, a tall open shaft that catches even a faint breeze and pulls it down into a room. No electricity, no moving parts. None of this is nostalgia, it's arithmetic. A tree or a white roof is the cheap step, the one every civilization reached for first for thousands of years, because it worked before anyone had a better option. We just forgot, for about a century, that it still does. Every summer, the news tells you the same story. Record-breaking heat wave, another heat dome over another continent. But zoom out, and the story was never really about the weather. It's about the pattern. The tree that shaded us today wasn't a gift from nature. It was a choice, made, in most cases, by someone who never thought about us at all. The concrete that burned our feet wasn't an accident either. It was a trade-off made for a rail yard or a parking lot before our parents were born. We crossed that line on the sidewalk in under a second. 51 degrees to 31, sun to shade. The climate didn't change. We just walked into a decision someone else made a very long time ago. And the question we're sitting with is this: what are we deciding, right now, for the person who walks this same sidewalk 100 years from now? I'm Leo. This is Pattern Notes. We gather here, and stories pass through us. This was one of them. See you next time.